Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen across the nation. Today we shall discuss a book on the making of the American Constitution, from inception right up until the latest and little-known 27th Amendment. The book is entitled America's Constitution, a Biography. Its author is Yale Law professor Akhil Amar, who is with me today to discuss his book. And I am Lawrence R. Valvell, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Akhil, thank you for driving up from New Haven today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start out. This is a long book with an absolute compendium of information on a host of subjects. And therefore the question arises, but written very understandably.
Thank you.
Very understandably. I once had an interview here with somebody who won the Pulitzer Prize, and I could hardly understand a third of his book. But be that as it may, this one is extremely understandable. But given the length, the compendium nature, the depth of the research, understandable but deep, who is the audience for your book and why?
Well, on my most ambitious days, I do hope that general readers of a certain sort will find the book useful. Maybe...
And they would be what kind of readers?
At the grandest level, someone in AP history or AP government, a 12th grader about to apply to college, a serious student interested in broadening her or his knowledge. Let me take that one step above. I teach not only at Yale Law School, but also in Yale College. This is a book basically aimed at my undergrad students. Half of them aren't going to go to law school at all. They're going to be doctors and physicists and stay-at-home spouses and everything in between. But they're going to be citizens of the world, and they, it seems to me, need to know something about our Constitution.
Look, if it's Yale College, judging by history and assuming that this pattern will not change, a lot of them are going to go into high positions in government at one time or another in his or her career.
They're going to be leaders of some sort, whether they are in government or not. They're going to be leaders in
And are there things you want them to understand?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then at the other end, law students, law professors, high school teachers of history and government, journalists, political leaders.
Do you I personally do, but I'd like to get your take on whether you think it's important that people begin to imbibe and absorb the ideas in this book.
I think that, especially when I teach in college, I see this course as part of their liberal education. They come to college and they get exposed to really important things that have happened in the world and that are still having effects. They might learn Shakespeare, and they might study Plato. They learn about Einstein and Freud, and they learn about the American Constitution in a kind of great books program.
You, in effect, are saying, now, to the audience, we had, Akhil was at lunch with the faculty today. Essentially, Akhil, you think that the American public, as do I, so I'm not objecting to this, but I'm trying to bring it out. You think that the American public has, and the American history profession too, which has been one of the sellers of a bill of goods, has been sold a bill of goods for about 200 years now on what happened in the 1780s. Is that roughly correct?
I go against conventional wisdom in certain regards, and let me just mention the three biggest themes of the book. I say that America's Constitution was, at the founding, and then over much of its history has been, more democratic than it's given credit for being for its time. It was, alas, more pro-slavery, more slavocratic than is often understood, and it was more about foreign policy and national security than is conventionally thought.
Let's take that one at a time. To the extent that you can make it briefly, say it briefly, it is hard to say it briefly. Why do you say that it was more democratic than is customarily thought? Now, many of us grew up, as you pointed out at lunch, schooled in the Charles Beard School of American History, which said this was essentially an attempt to place in power and keep in power the moneyed class.
Correct.
And you disagree with that.
Right.
Why, and think it was more democratic? Why do you say that?
Let's start with the first sentence. We, the people, do ordain and establish this Constitution. The thing was actually put to a popular vote. That's not just a word, it's a deed. We, the people, do this thing. It was a year-long process. There was a proposal that emerged from Philadelphia, but it wasn't going to be anything more than a piece of paper signed by 39 guys unless Americans across the continent actually voted for the thing. The vote was not rigged. Some states actually voted against it in 1788. Rhode Island didn't say yes immediately. North Carolina didn't say yes immediately. So when George Washington is elected the first president of the United States, there are actually only 11 states in the new union, so the fix was not in. It was a year-long process in which ordinary people across the continent actually got to vote on these basic ground rules.
Let me ask you this. You make the point, which is extremely striking, and I'd like to know how it happened, that even though there were property qualifications in those days, forget for a moment, let's put aside the fact that women couldn't vote and slaves couldn't vote, and free blacks couldn't vote. But you make a major point of saying that, although there were property qualifications to vote for governor, for legislature, etc., and to be in the legislature or in the governor's office, there were no property qualifications on voting for who would sit in the ratification conventions, or for that matter, for being in the ratification conventions.
The property qualifications in some places were eliminated altogether. In other places, they were lowered. They were in place, but lower than for regular elections. And in fact, there weren't racial qualifications even in many places. So in New York, for example, for the very first time in New York history, all adult free men are allowed to vote for this convention, which will decide whether to vote up the Constitution up or down. In 8 of the 13 states, you took the words right out of my mouth when I said "and," I was going to tell you. In this special year-long democratic conversation that Americans are having with each other, in 8 of the 13 states, in this special election on the Constitution, property qualifications are eliminated or lowered compared to what they were the day before, what they were for ordinary elections. From our point of view, it's still, of course, too limited. Women don't vote, slaves don't vote. But if you compare the Constitution not to what we've become 200 years later, but what were the rules the day before, which I think is the best historical baseline, it was more democratic than anything that had ever happened in the history of the world up to that point.
Why did that happen?